Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Steph, and if you're new here, I'm Steph. So today we're going to be talking about my most surprising books of 2022. Some of these could have made it onto my favorites list, but it was more so that they were very surprising how much I loved them because I probably went into them with low expectations. These are going to be in no particular order, but I do want to save one particular one for last because I really think that it has to take the top for the most surprising book this year. I didn't think I was gonna like this book. You might be able to guess what it is just based off of the millions of times that I tell you what my preferences are for books. You might be able to guess it, but I don't know. To start out with, I was very surprised that I loved Gideon the Ninth as much as I did. And this might be shocking for a few people just because I do think that this book is well loved. Although after reading it and talking about how much I liked it, many people told me how much they disliked it, which is a very funny thing about the internet. Obviously, when you're reading a book, you become a little bit more aware of the reviews, especially upon finishing it. I check out Goodreads reviews. I scour that site. And upon doing that, I did realize that yes, there are a lot of people who love this, but there are a lot more who dislike it. And I understand this is the most confusing book. As a matter of fact, the people who love it often talk about how they don't know what the fuck is happening in this book. And like, I couldn't agree more. I think the reason that this is the most surprising is because this is continuously pitched as necromancers in space. And that is not a false pitch, but it's not really the perfect pitch for this book. While I don't know what the perfect pitch for this book is, I will say that the necromancy is kind of at a low, but they are necromancers and they are in space, but more so they get invited to a mansion that's in space and it's more of a murder mystery. There's actually a whole murder mystery in here. And if you would have pitched it to me like that from the very beginning, I probably would have picked this up years ago. I think what is also really surprising is that when I first started this book, I did enjoy the characters and I did enjoy the banter, but I was like, this might be a little over the top for me. Like maybe they're trying a little bit too hard with this humor. And I don't know if you're like me, but oftentimes book humor doesn't land the same way as like television humor for me. But as I was making my way through this book, I was actually cracking up at a lot of things and I ended up becoming very obsessed with Gideon and Harrow. I do want to try to finish this series, but I'm very nervous that the confusion that is embedded into this series is gonna be too much. I think that in the next book, it's supposed to be more confusing. I don't know if my brain can handle that. I don't know if it's ready to go into overdrive. So while my goal is to finish this series this year, I don't know if it will actually happen in 2023. This next book is also a fantasy series that I was very surprised by, but I picked it up off the recommendation of Elliot Brooks, and that's Fireborn. So this was so pleasantly surprising. As you know, in 2022, I was especially having a hard time with YA fantasy, and getting into YA fantasy series was especially difficult for me. And I felt myself really, truly trying to break up with YA this year. And then the third and final book in this trilogy came out, and all of the hype around it made me excited to give it a try. But as it being YA, I did go in pretty skeptical. I was so pleasantly surprised by this. If you love political driven fantasy, this is your new fantasy book, especially if you're trying to transition from YA into adult fantasy. But I feel like this one in so many ways breaks the mold because the politics are impeccable in here. And I mean, the author has like a master's in political science, so this makes sense. The other thing that I was a little bit skeptical of, which pleasantly surprised me in this book, was the dragon aspect in here, because I always hesitate when somebody pitches me something as a dragon story, because oftentimes the dragons aren't really that big of a part of the story, at least as big of a part as I want them to be in the story. But in here, I feel like they're very present. So the main characters are dragon riders, and you get to spend a lot of time with dragons. But not only that, you get to really learn about how the dragon rider bond is created and maintained, and like what that means for these characters and how these dragons and these characters interact. And I thought that was very, very cool. I can definitely say this is one of the better dragon books that I've read, and I was so surprised at how just well fleshed out this world was, how well fleshed out the politics were, how much I really did enjoy these characters in the end. I didn't connect with them in the beginning, but by the end I was really involved in their storylines, and I'm excited to finish this series in 2023. This is also another goal, to finish this series. So this next book is very surprising because this author is actually ending up on like all of my lists for this year, but that's Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. So Certain Dark Things was actually published in 2016 and then was picked up by Tor and republished with this really cool cover. And honestly, up until recently, I thought this was going to be my favorite Sylvia Moreno Garcia book that I had ever read. I loved it so much. Her take on vampires was so interesting. The atmosphere in here is so unique. It's like this futuristic feel, but it also feels very noir. And there is a crime fiction aspect to this, but then there's vampires, and the vampire lore is very interesting. I would say that this would have made it onto my favorites list if it would have been a little bit longer and we would have gotten a little bit more about that vampire lore. But next to my favorite Sylvia Moreno Garcia book, which you will find out later in another list, I did really connect to the characters in here more than I ever have with any of her other books. So not only was the atmosphere really atmosphering, the characters were easier to relate to than in other books that I've read by her. So this was very surprising because I've just had such a roller coaster with her as an author, and I want to love her stuff. I want to continue loving her stuff. I just fear that my two favorites are part of her backlist. So where do we go from here, you know? Where do we go? So if you've been watching my videos for the last 2 years, then you'll probably have heard me say that I'm not really a romance reader. I don't read for romance. And I've come to find out, especially in 2022, that that's an absolute bold-faced lie. It's not that I don't read for romance. I actually realized, looking back on a lot of my favorite books, some of my favorite parts of those books are the romance. And so then I started to realize that maybe my problem is that I don't know what kind of tropes that I like, and so I keep picking up romance books where the tropes are just not the tropes that I end up liking. And I kind of tried to evaluate that this year and explore a little more out of my comfort zone when it came to romance, and I finally found one that was super surprising, and it almost made it onto my favorites list. But that is Delilah Green Doesn't Care. So this really surprised me because I went in really excited. I was very excited about it, but I had little expectations because I know how I am with contemporary romance. But boy, did I love this. I loved it. I was eating it up. I loved the humor in here. I loved the characters. It was so wonderful to read a sapphic romance where I was eating that shit up. I love sapphic romance, and the thing is we don't have a lot of very good sapphic romance or steamy sapphic romance either. That's a thing. That's weird. But I really, really loved this, and it was so surprising because the characters live in my brain rent-free. This isn't a small town. I love small town settings. So you have great characters, a small town, and the relationship. They were pining after each other. There was a bit of drama. I liked a little bit of the drama. Not a fan of the third act breakup in any romance. I don't know that many people are because I constantly see people complain about it. So obviously you could do without a third act breakup. But I really, really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the characters. I love seeing kind of, not older characters because I don't think 30s is old, but it is nice to see romance happening between people in their 30s, and obviously it being sapphic. So this had to make the list because if it couldn't be on my favorites, it was definitely the most surprising romance that I read and definitely kickstarted my sapphic romance search. I've been reading a lot of them this year. The next book on this list is on here because I think I've finally found a cult book that I really enjoyed enough to probably say it's my favorite cult book that I've read. And that's Just Like Mother. I hate this cover, by the way. Those little teeth right there, nasty. So this is obviously a cult book, but it also has themes about motherhood. And clearly I'm not a mother. I don't know if that was clear, but I'm not a mother. And so I do find it really interesting in horror books when motherhood is explored, but I could see how that would be really triggering for people if you are a mother. The one book that I kept comparing this to, and it's not because they are super similar by any means, but it's because of some of the storytelling structure in here that reminded me so much of The Push by Ashley Audrain. And that also explores motherhood, but this also explores the choice to not have children and how society often reacts to that. And the cult that is present in this book is a cult that is kind of against that choice to not have children. And so the exploration of those two dynamics was very interesting to me. I had never really seen it done before. And I just felt like this was the best cult book that I have read. I still am trying to explore whether or not I truly want/like cult books, but this is definitely the closest, if not my favorite cult book that I've ever read. I really liked the ending. I appreciated this ending, and I'm not sure that everyone will appreciate an ending like this, but I really did, and I had a great time. So this next book I never really had any intention of reading, but Sage ended up convincing me to read this book, and I loved it. It was such a surprise for me, and that's We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. Honestly, the reason I wasn't that interested in reading this book was because I had read Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour, and I just thought it was fine. Like, it was good, and I liked the themes in it, but it was just like a average 3 stars. So I had no intention of really going out of my way to read any of her other books. Then Sage convinced me to read this one, and as you can tell, maybe you can't tell, sometimes people's tabs don't mean good things, but for me, it does. This book, I think that this book won't be a 5 stars for everybody. I think for a lot of people, this book will hit them the way that Watch Over Me hit me, where it was just like, this is good. I like the themes, but like, I'm gonna forget it in a little while. The reason that this one means so much to me is because unexpectedly, it really mirrors a lot of my own grief and loss. The character has a connection with certain family members that I was also very close to growing up, and her life just looked a lot like mine in certain ways. And so I felt super connected to this character, and I felt super connected to her grief. And being quite a few years now removed from certain circumstances in my life that make me feel so connected to this book, I can say that this totally brought me back to those moments. I was just sobbing through this book. I just sobbed through this book. I read it in one day and I sobbed, and the writing, there's just so many lines in here. I'll try to find one. I can't find the exact quote that I was thinking of, but without spoiling anything, there's a line in here that says, she'll still be herself and I'll be learning who I am now. And what she's referencing is the fact that after this loss, she is now a different person. Even though she looks the same and seems the same to everyone else around her, after this monumental loss, she is no longer the same person. And so how do you move forward with people in your life who are still kind of living in a moment of your life that is no longer your life, and you're moving forward and becoming this new person that you don't quite understand, and you don't quite understand how grief now fits into your life and how a part of you oftentimes kind of dies with that person. Anyway, this was the most surprising book. Absolutely loved it. On a semi-lighter note, I guess, the next book that was really surprising to me is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. I ended up giving this 5 stars, and I loved the romance in here. I know this is a beloved book. It's actually very popular among my friends on Goodreads. I think it has like a very high rating. And so like, obviously I went in with high expectations, but I was still surprised, mainly because of how much I really loved the writing style in here. And secondly, because how much I loved the relationship that formed in this book, which, you know me, when I feel like a romance is shoehorned into a book, I get very irritated, but this just didn't feel that way. It felt so organic and real, and that's not even like the scope of this book. She's trying to solve a murder that happened years ago that she believes the person they think did it didn't do it. And while there's some unrealistic aspects to this book in terms of she's a teenager doing this, bizarre, but I don't know, it just worked. And I was very surprised at how much I loved this. I loved the podcast element to it. It was a really good time, and I'm excited because there's a few more books in this series. But this is very surprising because with YA mysteries, I usually like them, but they're never a favorite. They never stick with me or stand out to me, but I genuinely think that this is probably one of my favorite YA mysteries that I've ever read. I'm not sure that I need to say much more about it. It is one of the most hyped books, one of the most beloved books on YouTube, and I understand when people don't really enjoy this book, but I think that if you are someone who enjoys YA mysteries and you haven't read this, then I would give it a try. I would listen to the audiobook as well. This in ways was giving Sadie, but pretty much only because of the podcast element. I have to say that I think that next to Sadie, this is definitely one of my all-time favorite YA mysteries. It also taught me that I love a mystery more than a thriller. I'm definitely a mystery girl. The second to last book on this list is Vita Nostra. The thing about Vita Nostra is it's a mindfuck. Like, I don't fully think I understand what happened in this book, and I definitely want to reread it, but from the very beginning, I was hooked. It was such a weird experience. Sometimes it felt like you were on an acid trip because nothing made sense. But at the same time, this did such a great job at critiquing academia. I think it did a really great job at showing you the realities of being a student and trying to succeed in academia. But the thing about this book is it's not a regular school. Like, it's not a regular school setting. You actually don't know for the majority of this book what they're studying. You kind of have a vague idea, but you don't know what they're studying and what they're trying to accomplish and what they will do after they graduate this program. And it's so bizarre. Like, in the beginning, there's this guy that keeps popping up in our main character's life, and every time he tells her to do these random things, and after she does those random activities, she throws up coins. And that's how she's able to attend this program, this academic program. And it's so bizarre, it's so weird, but it has stuck with me for so long. Like, I think about this reading experience all the time, and I also just think about how I don't know what the fuck happened in this book. And I don't think this is a book for everybody, but it just hit me the right way. And luckily I had a few friends who have read this and really enjoyed it, so we were chatting about it, and we all have different theories, but they were so interesting. I loved hearing other people's theories about this book. And I think that's what's also really fun about this book and makes it such a surprising read, is how many different theories people have and the different conversations you can have about this book and what happened here. I think the reason that this didn't make it onto my favorites list is because the men in here are garbage. Absolute garbage. But otherwise, I had a really great time. So the last book on this list, and the one that absolutely has to be the most surprising read of 2022, is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I had no interest in Andy Weir, number one. Number two, I think I thought that this was more epic sci-fi than it really is. I feel like Andy Weir is more of a cozy sci-fi person, and I didn't really know that going into it. So that was surprise number two. Surprise number three was how connected I felt to the two characters in here, like the two main characters in here. So it was such a pleasant surprise to read this because I really loved it. And I had no interest in Andy Weir before. I had no interest in The Martian, even though it was everywhere. It's been made into a movie. So many people love it. I just was really convinced that I wouldn't like it. And I didn't realize that it was more cozy sci-fi than anything else. He does try to bring a lot of humor into his sci-fi, and sometimes it landed and sometimes it didn't for me. But that's not unusual with most books. I think I said this earlier about another book where the humor sometimes lands, but I just really enjoyed what this book was doing. And there's some twists in here that I think are something you can see coming, but other ones that are shocking. Even though there was a lot of science in here, it definitely didn't take away from the story, and you didn't really need to understand it to know what was happening in the story. There are a few things that I felt were a little convenient, but otherwise I really loved this, and I definitely am gonna try to read The Martian now, and I'll probably read other things by Andy Weir, which is the biggest surprise of all. Let me know down below if you've read any of these. Let me know some of your surprising books of 2022. And if you've made it this far and you have nothing else to say, just leave a book stack emoji down in the comments below, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.